All right, guys. Hey, so today we're looking at 2.3, the Jefferson Presidency. So far in Unit 2, we've gone through Washington and Adams, and this is Jefferson's presidency. So we're going to see something kind of different here. And actually, starting off, there's kind of a big deal that I want to address, and that is what's called the Revolution of 1800, often known as just the election of 1800. So the big deal with this is it is a sitting president, John Adams, who is pretty unpopular this time versus the challenger, who you might remember is also his vice president. So in this election, we have Federalist Adams versus Democratic Republican Jefferson. And you can see here the electoral vote is pretty tight. Jefferson wins 53 to 47. And again, with the size of the country at this time, the electoral votes is pretty low. Worth pointing out here that Jefferson and Burr both receive votes for the party. So what has to happen here is the House of Representatives actually picks who wins, and that is going to be Jefferson. So big kind of subplot here is Hamilton, who dislikes both of these men. They're both Democratic Republicans. He has a lot more beef with Burr than Jefferson. Hamilton is able to swing the House to vote for Jefferson, and Jefferson becomes president through the means of Hamilton, his nemesis. So that's kind of an interesting one here. The big reason Hamilton doesn't support Burr is because he doesn't know what Burr's stances on anything is, or what his stances are, I should say. He knows what Jefferson's going to do when he's president, and he's kind of like the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So his big beef with Burr is that he just sees Burr as kind of a wishy-washy kind of guy. Jefferson is a strong leader, although most of the things Jefferson does, Hamilton really just does not like. So Jefferson's going to be president, and Burr is going to be his vice president. That's the first time we're going to have that kick in because of the new amendment here. Okay. The big deal with this, the Revolution of 1800, is it's the first time we've changed political party. So we went from Washington, who wasn't really in a political party, but technically is considered a Federalist, to Adams, who is a Federalist, and now we're switching from Federalist to Democratic Republican. So that's kind of a big deal here, and it's a peaceful transfer of power. Now, I really like to emphasize this because if you look at other countries around the world when they have elections, some of those countries, when there's a change from one president to another, we see violence. We see someone saying that the results of the election don't count, accusations of fraud, accusations of rigging the ballot. And we could have seen that for this election. We could have seen Adams, pitch a fit and say, I'm not leaving the White House, and Jefferson's a cheat and all of that. But we don't. And we see Adams gracefully say, okay, good luck. Wish you the best. I don't like you, but, we want our country to succeed. So I'm not rooting against you. And Adams leaves the White House, Jefferson takes over, and it's a peaceful transfer of power. So that's why it's called the Revolution of 1800. It's not really a revolution like when you think of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. It's more of a quiet revolution, change in political party, but with no bloodshed or any kind of upheaval. So Jefferson's presidency, he is very laissez-faire. And this is a term that maybe you're familiar with from civics, but he's hands-off, and he actually wants the government to not get involved in a lot of issues. He's going to reduce the size of the army. He's going to reduce taxes, reduce government expenses, and he's going to reduce the power of the national bank, which, if you remember, was a Hamilton invention back in Washington's presidency. So this is kind of classic anti-federalist thinking. He doesn't want the federal government to be super duper important. He wants the federal government to be there for the necessities, self-defense, right? If the government gets attacked, we want a federal government to be strong and to stand up against that. Also providing certain benefits and collecting taxes from the states and from people to provide what would be federal services. Now, again, we're going to talk about some Jefferson things he does at the first part here, and then we're going to kind of talk about how Jefferson kind of goes against his principles. There's a Jefferson quote here. This might be a document of the day, actually. Every government degenerates when trusted to the rules of the people alone. The people themselves, therefore, are its only safe depositories. So he doesn't trust people in government. He trusts people when they're not in government. And so he thinks less government is better. Jefferson has a ton of quotes like this that show his distrust of government. His presidency, we're going to kind of talk about westward expansion, which is going to be a theme that we continue for multiple presidents. A couple guys like James K. Polk are really going to be big into westward expansion. and also the Barbary Wars. This little video here explains the Barbary Wars, but it's not a major war. It's mostly pirates attacking ships, and Jefferson kind of says, well, we can't be attacked, so we're going to fight against them. Um, and there's our quote again for some reason on this slide as well. Okay, big Supreme Court case here that hopefully you learned in civics. It's called Marbury versus Madison. So on the way out of the White House, John Adams is going to appoint federal judges. Now, the important part of this is federal judges serve life terms. Okay, so if you get a federal judge job, you don't have to worry about somebody kicking you out. You don't have to worry about being reelected. You basically just get that job for life, which is awesome. But Adams is going to appoint a bunch of federal judges right at the last minute. James Madison is supposed to authorize this paperwork, and James Madison, who's a Democratic Republican, basically just lets the due date come and go and says, oopsie, this didn't get a signature, so these people don't have federal jobs. One of these judges, Marbury, says, well, look, I sold my house. I bought a house in D.C. I moved my wife and kids up to D.C. because I was told I was getting this federal job, this federal judge job, and now you're saying I didn't get it because you didn't sign paperwork. And he says, I'll see you in court. And so Marbury sues Madison over not getting his job. And this forces the Supreme Court to step in and make a ruling here. And so the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, you can see pictured here, decides to weigh in on this and says, look, Marbury, sorry, bud, you didn't get your job. And keep in mind, John Marshall is a Federalist as well. And so the really big thing here is not necessarily the backstory of this case, but it's the first time the Supreme Court does anything. So it's kind of weird to think that like our country under the Constitution started in 1787. The Washington presidency starts in 1789. Washington's reelected in 1792. Adams is elected in 1796. And now we run into the first situation where the Supreme Court does something of note. And so the real big precedent here with Marbury versus Madison is that it establishes this term here in capital letters, judicial review. The biggest important thing to know about Marbury versus Madison is without this case, no other Supreme Court cases exist because this is the one where the Supreme Court does something for the first time. So in class, what I'll try and get you all to do is when I say Marbury versus Madison, you say judicial review. And when I say judicial review, you say Marbury versus Madison. That word association might seem super cheesy to you, and I get that, but I almost guarantee that if you see a question about Marbury versus Madison, the answer choice will have something to do with judicial review. The answer choice might even just say judicial review, and then boom, there's your answer. But definitely read your questions first, obviously. So that's Marbury versus Madison. And skipping the video. One of the things Jefferson does that's a huge success, although very controversial, is he purchases the Louisiana Territory from France. Now, simplistically, he's giving France money for this land. But more complicatedly, he's actually just giving France money for the deed to the land. Because as you might know, or as you might remember from issues with the French and Indian War and the Proclamation Line of 1763 and wars that Washington fights against the Native Americans, is this land here that's white, called the Louisiana Purchase Territory, is actually mostly Native Americans. And so no Native Americans received any money from this transaction. France gets a bunch of money, and the Native Americans are kind of like, wait a second, France just sold our land for $15 million? It's kind of like selling someone else's house and then, expecting them to move out. It was a complete surprise for a lot of these Native American tribes in this region that they're now part of the United States. They didn't even consider themselves part of France yet, so it's kind of a wild one. But this doubles the size of the United States overnight. And the big controversy here is Jefferson is paying for this $15 million land purchase, which I think works out to be about 3 cents an acre. It's a pretty sweet deal. He does this without congressional approval. And so he is signing a treaty without Congress, which is a violation of the Constitution. The other big deal with this is the money he's using to pay for this comes from Hamilton's National Bank. So he's doing two things that old Jefferson would have had a fit on. He's skipping Congress, which is violating the Constitution that he loves and is very literal, right? He's a strict interpretationist. And he's using a thing that he opposed when he was in the cabinet with Hamilton. So there's some issues there with Jefferson and how he kind of mentally gymnastics this. Um, so yeah, once he gets that land, he's going to do an uncongressionally approved thing and send Lewis and Clark with their guide Sacagawea into this new territory. So he's kind of saying, "Look, I bought this land. I don't know what's there." And he doesn't really want to admit that to the American people. So what he does is he sends out a secret expedition for them to travel and see all of this stuff. Okay. Napoleon, who you may have heard of in world history, he is going to be a guy over in Europe taking over a bunch of territory. That's part of the reason that we bought Louisiana from France is because he's fighting a war in Europe. He doesn't really care about this chunk of land that's supposed to be French. In fact, that land was Spanish, but when Napoleon invaded Spain, he was able to basically say, okay, well, all Spanish territory is mine now. So he sells the land to the United States. It's a pretty good piece of business for Napoleon, even though America thinks they got the better end of the deal. Napoleon says, you gave me $15 million for land that I never really had, and I'm able to use that 15 million to fight England and Spain and Germany and Prussia and Italy and all these other places. So the British don't like that we're going to do this stuff with France. We're giving them money, and so they start impressing our soldiers. Not impressing with cool tricks and magic, but impressment, which is taking those U.S. sailors off of British or off of ships and forcing them to work for the British government. This leads to an event called the Chesapeake Incident, and Jefferson's response to this is to just say, "I'm not going to trade anymore with France and I'm not going to trade anymore with Britain." And so he issues something called the Embargo Act. Now, an embargo is cutting off trade, but this Embargo Act cuts off trade with France and Britain. If you can think of two of our biggest trade partners in the world at this time, it's France and Britain, and this is not going to go well economically speaking. Now, again, Jefferson is doing this for a very good reason. The British are taking our men off of ships, um, but this is going to basically shut down the trade economy in places like New England, especially places like New York, that rely heavily upon shipping. It's also going to hurt the South because the South produces cotton and tobacco and other crops, and their largest market is Europe. And so they're not able to sell as much cotton or tobacco. And so the South is hurting from this as well, but not maybe as much as the North. So this is going to be his biggest mistake as president. He approaches this problem as, he's getting beat in basketball in pickup. So what does he do? He takes the ball and he goes home, right? He's tired of getting his sailors harassed by the British, and so he is just going to cut off all trade and say no more U.S. ships are going to go to France or Britain. Towards the end of Jefferson's presidency, we're going to see an issue here with Native Americans. And one of the big issues with this is Native Americans are kind of secretly being armed with the British government or by the British government. And so we view the British as trying to help the Native Americans fight the US government. And that is going to lead to a war with Native Americans. This culminates in the Battle of Tippecanoe, which the General Tecumseh, Native American general you can see here, was defeated by William Henry Harrison. Okay. In that conflict, as I mentioned, there's British rifles found. And so warhawks, these people that are going to be very much advocating for war against Britain, because Britain has been stealing sailors off our ships, and now we've seen that they've given weapons to Native Americans. They're going to call for war with Britain. The hope here is that they can gain territory, not just defeat Native Americans and take that territory, and clear out Native Americans, which again is a continuation from the 1600s and 1700s, but also take parts of Canada, which is British territory. Right, we're kind of a new country that has to our northern border British territory still, Canada. So this conflict begins in Jefferson's, but it's going to be continued into Madison, and we're going to get to Madison's presidency as well. So James Madison is really going to have to fight the rest of this, which is going to be called the War of 1812. So that is all we have on Jefferson's presidency.